if you think that your whole organism is mine, no, it's not. Like there's some basic and foundational principles that are of course the same. But if you're looking at like generalized advice, and this is what I get worried about when we talk about things on podcasts as well, is like I don't want to give somebody like the advice that we're talking is more generalizations. Like anything specific, you really got to figure out on your own with testing on your own, like your N=1 kinds of stuff.
All right, Dr. Scott Sherr, when it comes down to sleep, what actually creates sleep pressure? How do we end up falling asleep? People talk about melatonin, this and that, but it's much more than that. Like what makes us sleep?
Yeah, so melatonin makes us feel sleepy, but it doesn't actually give us sleep pressure as much as this neurotransmitter. But it's not just a neurotransmitter. It has many different roles, called adenosine. Adenosine is a molecule in the body that has lots of different roles. But one of the major things it does is it builds up during the day and makes us feel sleepy. It gives us that sleep pressure. So if you have kids, which I know you do and I do as well, you can see when they're getting so tired, it's that sleep pressure has gotten to such a significant degree. And then as soon as they fall asleep, they just go down, like they're just down in a deep sleep. So if you have good sleep pressure, which actually most of us need, and to get deep sleep, it's the same thing when you're a kid. It's just, you become an adult, you have not as much sleep pressure because that it does decline over time as well. But the idea is that adenosine is the key to that. But adenosine has a lot more roles than just sleep pressure, as you know.
And after today's video, I put a link down below for Troscriptions, which is a pretty interesting troche delivery with a particular compound they call Tro-Z. So it's a unique blend of different compounds that help you fall asleep and help you stay asleep. And we're going to get into the neuroscience. We're going to get into some of the actual neurotransmitter function and how this works with Dr. Scott Sherr later in this episode. But in the interim, there is a link down below for you to check out Troscriptions. They have a number of different products ranging from Tro-Calm, which is something to help you kind of relax and ease down. Then they also have their Tro-Z plus a number of other products. So that link is down below in the top line of the description, just underneath this video. The particular compound's really interesting as well. It has a small dose of melatonin, although it also has something called agarine, which comes from a mushroom, really unique compound. And this is going to be what helps you sort of stay asleep and not pop out of that sleep. We all wake up at kind of 2 or 3 a.m., so really interesting. And additionally, it also has adenosine, which is what creates sleep pressure. People have heard of adenosine triphosphate, but adenosine is what kind of gives us that pressure to fall asleep. So if you were to go out and run 10 miles, you'd build up this sleep pressure. So really unique in that it helps you fall asleep in a different way from other sleep compounds, plus a unique delivery system that you actually put up into your gums so it absorbs fast. So really interesting stuff. So again, down below, and we'll talk about the science of it later in this episode. So like with a kid, for example, I mean, is it because like they have less resistance to just like, they don't really throttle their energy, like they just go all out, so they deplete it more and then how does that kind of work?
Well, with kids, they have so many different things going on, right? Their metabolic rate is much, much higher in general. So as a result of that, they're going to create more adenosine faster that way. So adenosine is made in a lot of different ways, but it increases throughout the day because you're making more of it, often because you're making it as a result of making a lot more energy, and then you have a lot less ATP around, so you have the molecules of energy, adenosine, right? So adenosine is what we make ATP with, right? So if you have ATP, you're using a lot of adenosine because you're making it in ATP. That molecule doesn't go away. It doesn't it gets recycled and it gets used in various different places in the body, including the brain. So you're gonna have, and the more active you are, the more adenosine you typically have to play with, at least when you're a kid, but that changes as actually when you're an adult, interestingly enough.
I have this theory that like eventually we're gonna get to this point where we realize that like 8 hours, although been demonstrated in a lot of things, is it gonna kind of be like food guide pyramid where we're like, actually, like it's highly individual?
It's highly individual, yeah. I mean, you have a certain segment of people, like maybe like 5% of the people in the United States, or at least in the world, that probably don't need more than about 6 hours of sleep. Like a lot of people out there, I know maybe I was one of those when I was back in medical school that said, I can get away with 6 hours, no problem. I think there is a limit in the sense of how little people need to sleep. In general, I think 6.5 hours tends to be like the minimum for most people, 6.5. And then 8 hours is probably more than enough for most people. But I think they've done even studies, I think you've seen these, where if you sleep too much, it actually has an inverse relationship where actually you die faster if you sleep too much at night as well. Now, this is not in your like elite athletes and people that are doing a lot of exercise, because they tend to need more sleep, even though it might be actually harder for them to get it because they're depleting things like adenosine, but also there's other things that get depleted, of course, when you're, exercising a lot and you're overtraining, and then you're dealing with your stress hormones and your catecholamines and things like that also, get depleted over time. That if you're not working on that, if you're not thinking about that you may see that your sleep gets trashed as a result of those things as well. So adenosine is just one portion of the things here that we have to think about, but we don't realize that that's the major reason why we get sleep pressure. And what does caffeine do? As many of us know, caffeine actually makes us feel more awake. It makes us feel more alert because it actually blocks those receptors from binding adenosine. So as a result of that, in your brain, you can't bind those receptors, and so you don't feel sleepy. That's why you feel more wakeful when you drink coffee or have caffeine.
And then when the caffeine wears off, you get a big flood of it? Is that?
Yes. Well, it can be like that drop that people get, that crash that people get. So and the thing about caffeine that's good is that it's relatively long acting. So it's like the half-life of caffeine is a while. So it's not like you just go from a very high level and then 2 hours later you drop very precipitously. Usually it's, I can't remember the exact half-life of caffeine, but I think it's like 6 to 12 hours. And so you typically don't see like a huge drop in many people. So they won't feel like there's a huge crash, but that crash that's coming down is because those adenosine receptors are like, oh, I can bind my adenosine again. This is great. And then you get into this cycle where you just have to drink more caffeine, and then you get these cycles and crashes and burns, and like that's the cycle that a lot of people get into with a lot of caffeine drinking. Especially if you're having things like sugar or like other things that are going to help make those crashes even more profound. If you're having like sugar energy drinks or something like that. So,
what about caffeine plus exercise, independent of fat oxidation and stuff like that, like energy utilization? Like if you're giving yourself more energy from caffeine, but you're blasting it and you're working out hard and you're like zapping through all that, is there less of a downside? Or
so we don't know. I don't know if this has been studied exactly, but I do think that if you were giving caffeine and you're blocking adenosine receptors in the brain, that you have the potential to use more of that adenosine to make ATP, to make energy. So that's why I think people feel, amongst other reasons, that there is an energy production capacity. There's hormones that are being released. There's neurotransmitters that are being released, especially when you have caffeine, that increase your drive and your pump kind of feel when you're at the gym. But I think that there is something going on there with adenosine as well. Adenosine is helping us make more energy. So if you're diverting it from your brain to your energy centers in your muscle, especially your mitochondria, I think that's why one of the reasons why people feel more energetic when they're at the gym and working out.
If we're talking about sleep pressure, we're talking about exercise, things like that, I'll use myself as an example here, and I know there's a lot of people that are like that, like this. I'm a very active person, and on a day when I'm active, obviously my sleep demand would be a little bit higher.
Yes.
But I've also found that in a very acute fashion, like if I don't work out for a couple of days, I notice my sleep demand is less almost immediately. It's like maybe I'm just in tune with it. Maybe there's some. Does that happen as we get older? Like, do we become like finally like in tune with sort of our activity level, our sleep pressure for that day? Like, when does it reset? Like, if I do a big event, not talking a monstrous event, but let's say a couple hours of endurance exercise or something, enough to create sleep pressure, I'll likely, if my calories are high enough, if things are in place, I'll sleep decent that night because I created a lot of sleep pressure. But then let's take another day where maybe I didn't work out for 2 days and I was very sedentary. I'll have a hard time sleeping. Is that simply because like I've changed my baseline for sleep pressure?
I think it's a couple things going on there. I think that you do have a bigger store or bigger supply or reservoir of adenosine that needs to play around, right? So then if you're saying that you sleep worse after not exercising for a couple of days?
Generally. Day one of not exercising, I sleep well.
Okay.
But once it's beyond 1 day, then it's like my body's like, I don't need this sleep. Like it's like I'm not being taxed enough, It's
interesting. Yeah. So it must be some sort of balance that you're creating with the energy metabolism in your cells itself and how that's affecting, the neurotransmitter balance in the brain. I'm not really sure what's going on there exactly from an adenosine perspective. I think that there's obviously other things that are going on from a hormonal perspective for sure. Like we know that if you exercise, you're going to be releasing more growth hormone, right? And growth hormone is really important to help us maintain sleep at night. So if you're not exercising and you're used to exercising at a certain level, for example, as you are, then you don't have that growth hormone spike that you typically would have after a lot of exercise. You're not going to get that same kind of sleep that you would have if you had been exercising, for example. So we know that, growth hormone is a really important one. And as we get older, growth hormone starts getting depleted. Most people start declining in their growth hormone levels somewhere around 30 or 40 years of age. And so, but if you're exercising, exercise gives you a big burst of the growth hormone. So I think that's probably what you're feeling more than the adenosine itself that's causing the challenges in sleep that you're having if you're not exercising because you're used to doing it so often.
So what happens like chemically within the brain or even from a neurotransmitter level when we have that night of relatively poor sleep and we feel kind of restless and a little anxious the next day, like what's happening? Is there a compensatory mechanism that's trying to, like, what's going on there?
Yeah, so when you don't sleep well, a lot of your stress hormones will go up, like your cortisol level will go up, your norepinephrine level will go up. So you'll be in more of like a sympathetic state as a result of that, because the body is trying to compensate for you not sleeping by giving you these stress hormones to keep you awake and to do what you need to do. I mean, this goes back to like being an animal, and when humans are the only animals, I think we discussed this last time, that actually purposefully deprive themselves of sleep. No other animals on the planet do that except for humans, because we have these big brains that tell us that it's okay to do that sometimes, to study for a test or to to sleep less for whatever reason, right? So in general, when you don't sleep, evolutionarily, that means from an animal perspective, something's wrong. Like, we got to make sure that we got, we have our stress hormones up, that we're alert, that we're doing things. But that can also dysregulate the system extremely significantly as well. If you have all these stress hormones that are up, your immune system also gets depressed as well, because your stress hormones are up. So, and this happens just with one night of sleep even as well. I mean, certainly it's doable to have a couple nights of sleep where you don't sleep well, and you can compensate for that. But in general, when you don't sleep well, you have this like sort of sympathetic fight or flight response that's very difficult. And so your blood sugars are hard to control, your mood's hard to control, your energy levels are hard to control. And then often people think that they need more stimulants to keep them awake, but they're also, the problem is actually they're also sympathetically dominant. So that depletes all your sympathetic hormones over time, over short periods of time, really. So you have to be really careful there. So sleep is extremely important. In fact, we think that the sort of baseline state of the evolutionary sort of biology or evolution of the organism itself was actually a sleep state first, because that's when we can rest and we can digest and we can actually process the environment in a very relaxed way, even as primordial. But now we've had to become awake so that we can go forage for food, we could go find things, we could find mates and things like that. So our rest state is this parasympathetic sleep state, and if we don't get that, we don't do well. That's really what it comes down to.
Man, makes me wonder if our awake conscious state is just there to support our sleep state.
Exactly. So that's some of the evolutionary thoughts, is that the idea is that everything that we do is to support that parasympathetic, that rest, that sleep state in general. So
interesting.
Most of us are on all the time, because that's just the nature of the human society, the social cultural programming that we all have. But in general, our base state, if you look at most organisms, like look at a tiger, for example, how much do they actually move in a day? Like very, very little.
Yeah, it's just the catalyst for what happens during their sleep. And also probably, at least with intellectual creatures such as humans, it's probably a lot of evolutionary growth that's happening from a sleep state.
Yes.
Cognitively. Right?
Huge.
Like dream state, all these things.
Yeah.
Right?
There's a huge pruning that happens. So everything that you're subject to during the day, all the environmental stimuli, everything you thought of, like all that stuff has to get pruned at night so that you don't have all those connections you don't need. And this is why kids need to sleep more than adults in general, because kids have a ton of information that's being just thrown at them at all times. And you've had kids, right? You can see how open they are to everything, and they have to have more sleep so that they can actually prune those connections and rewire the brain so that they actually can understand all the things that they just went through and not keep all the stuff that they don't need as well. So sleeping is a huge component. And then we all have like the lymphatic system in the brain, which is the part of the brain, like the lymphatic system of our brain that they discovered maybe 15 years ago, that helps release all of and detoxifies all the things that are happening in the brain. This happens when we're sleeping, and it doesn't happen very much when we're awake. So if you can't detoxify the brain, you have things like amyloid and other things that can kind of be created over time that can't get out of the brain. And amyloid, of course, is not a good thing for the brain. And amyloid is one of those things that's been associated with Alzheimer's and with Parkinson's and cognitive decline and things like that. But the thing with amyloid is interesting, is that there was this whole hypothesis, I don't know if you know about this, is kind of a tangential, but like there's this whole hypothesis now that's been derailed because all the research was forged in the early 2000s that amyloid was the cause of Alzheimer's, right? But amyloid actually is a response to inflammation or stress in the brain. So if you have more inflammation, more stress in the brain, you're going to have more amyloid. But that's not a bad thing if you can actually get rid of the amyloid by having good ways of getting rid of that, which would be addressing the inflammation, addressing infection, but also getting good sleep. And that's the crux of it all here.
Interesting. I kind of learned through the grapevine that on the days you don't get good sleep, that high heat sauna is one of the only ways that you can kind of create the intracranial pressure to help flush the lymphatic system a little bit. It's still not the same as sleep, but it's I don't even want to call it a close second. It's a far second, but it's a way that you can create more intracranial pressure. So again, don't know how much that's flushed out. That's one of those things that I learned from special forces medics that are just like, no, this is no.
Well, those guys are great at napping though too, right?
That's true.
I think those guys have all the skills when it comes to napping, and I think that's what I always tell my patients, and that I always feel like is missed, is that you can also just take a nap. Like, you don't have to power through your afternoon with another cup of coffee. Like, if you can just get a 20-minute nap, that's a great reset for a lot of people if you don't get a good amount of sleep the night before. And so I was never a big fan of napping when I was younger, but I am a huge fan of napping now. And I'm not talking about 90-minute naps. We're talking about 20 minutes to 30 minutes of a nap can be a much better reset for your brain, especially if you had a really hard morning. If you're studying really hard or working really hard and learning a lot, like a 20-minute nap is a huge way to start consolidating some of that information so that you actually can remember it and enjoy the rest of your day and not just try to power through.
Does that wreck your sleep pressure for the night though?
If you do it early enough in the day, and then you also make sure it's short enough, it doesn't. No. Yeah. If you do it later in the day and you have like longer naps, like if you have like a 60-minute or 90-minute nap and you're getting a lot of deep sleep during that nap, you may wreck some of your sleep pressure. But in general, if you're getting like a nap about 20 to 30 minutes in length, and it's usually early in the day, like early in the afternoon, like before 3 o'clock usually is what I typically recommend my patients do. And that doesn't really wreck their sleep pressure at all. But it depends on their day. Like, it depends on how early they're getting up and what time they're going to bed, and lots of different factors. Sometimes a nap at 11 o'clock in the morning is the best time to do it if you're going to bed at 8 o'clock in the evening, for example. So it just depends on what your schedule is. So this is when you were saying that like everything's so personalized and it's hard to have like just like a blanket response, like an 8-hour sleep window for everybody. No, I think for some people it's 6, some people it's 8, some people it's 7, and it also depends on how much exercise they did or didn't do and what their hormonal responses to the world are, if they're females, if they're in their cycle. Like, there's so many different pieces here that like it's very difficult to say 8 hours, but that's what that's what epidemiology, that's what public health is all about, right? Just give everybody the same thing and just hope that the majority of people get a benefit from it, where I don't want to just be one person in like an epidemiological study. I want to be me, right? And that's what my patients want. That's what you want, right? They don't want don't just treat me like one person out of a million, because I'm not. I'm just me. And then I'm this whole organism, right? I have all these things going on. I have human cells, I have bacteria, fungus, virus that are all in me all the time, right? That are all communicating in various different ways. Like the bacteria cells in our gut are communicating with our mitochondria in our cells. Like there's all this happening, and has nothing to do with what's happening to you. It's happening to me, right? Yeah. So, and there's obviously some correlations, but it's very, very different. But it was a cool study that was done on this thing called like inter-kingdom crosstalk, where you have like this kingdom, meaning like you have the phyla of like your fungus, virus, and bacteria that are talking to your cells at all times and making decisions as a result of the little vesicles that they send to each other. Like, and it's awesome. Like, but like all this stuff is happening. So wild. It's wild, right? So if you think that your whole organism is mine, no, it's not. Like there's some basic and foundational principles that are of course the same, but if you're looking at like generalized advice, and this is what I get worried about when we talk about things on podcasts as well, is like I don't want to give somebody like the advice that we're talking is more generalizations. Like anything specific, you really got to figure out on your own with testing on your own, like your N=1 kinds of stuff.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about like what's the problem with sort of the overuse of melatonin.
Okay.
Because I think that's I think people just default to, okay, I'm going to take 5 milligrams of melatonin and it knocks me out. And like, what are some downsides with that?
Yeah, I think that the first thing to say here is that melatonin does decline as we get older. It's the highest when we're around our teenage years, and then it starts slowly going down, and then I think in our 40s and 60s it starts going down even more precipitously. So melatonin is a hormone that comes from our pineal gland, which is part of our brain, and it gets secreted with the daylight cycles. So you also have another type of melatonin as well, that's actually produced in our mitochondria, and it's one of the most powerful antioxidants that we have that combats oxidative stress in our mitochondria as well. So two different types of melatonin. Okay, you have your melatonin that's produced when we have our sleep-wake cycles, and then we have our melatonin that's produced in our mitochondria. So both of those go down as we get older. So when it comes to the day-night cycles, the challenge is that I think people are taking melatonin without trying to optimize behavior first, right? Because you can do a lot to support your melatonin production by yoking yourself to the sun as much as possible. So seeing the sunlight in the morning resets your circadian rhythms, resets your melatonin production so that it increases at night. Looking at the sunset at night and only looking at dim light and red lights or in that color spectrum before you go to bed or after the sun goes down will continue to allow your melatonin production to go up as you go to bed. But if you look at bright lights after sunset goes down, if you're looking at your screens, for example, TVs, it doesn't matter, phones, all that has this brighter light called the blue spectrum that's going to increase melatonin production. So in the mornings when you're up in the sunlight, you're increasing that blue light, and that's really important because it shuts down melatonin production. That's what you want, and then that's why you feel more wakeful, right? But so I think the first thing to say is that there's some easy behavior changes that people can do to increase their own melatonin production, even as they're getting older, okay? And I think that's the easiest one for most of the people that I work with is just to get them off the screens at night, or if they're on screens at night, try to use filters or blue blockers or something like that. It's a harder ask to have people look at the sun in the morning when they wake up, or look at the sunset when they're going, but before they go to bed or when the sun's going down. But if they can do that as well, and then they can start using their dietary strategies along the circadian rhythms that they're creating with the sunlight exposure, and their melatonin production is going to go up as well there. So, but when it comes to taking melatonin, there is a lot of, so I have friends that are in the cancer world that are giving 1,000 milligrams of melatonin, and their patients are sleeping fine. Okay, so I don't think that. There is a worry that if you take too much melatonin, that you're going to downregulate your own body's production. There really is no evidence of that. Okay, so people don't have to worry about that, but it's kind of like taking a Band-Aid. If you just take melatonin, but you're not looking at why you need the melatonin, like that's really where I start getting more interested and really try to start digging in with my patients, right? So, but most people shouldn't, need that much melatonin unless they're, on the older side, if like you're over 60 years of age, like typically you do need more melatonin to help you go to bed. Even with all your circadian rhythms and behaviors, like it's very difficult to get enough melatonin to maintain your sleep throughout the night. But if you're younger than that, then you should be able to do significant amounts to compensate for that decline by, with good rhythms of the sun and, good vitamin, mineral, and nutrient intake. The precursors of melatonin as well. So some of your neurotransmitters, for example, like your serotonin, for example, turns in, or is it norepinephrine? Norepinephrine turns into melatonin. So like you have to have good production of all these other neurotransmitters as well that are helping you make it more of it. So you have to think about it more holistically. So what I do think that melatonin on its own can be good for is if you are changing time zones. I don't usually recommend supplementing melatonin on its own typically, if you're going to be supplementing, because melatonin itself can help with changing your circadian rhythm, which is good. So when people are traveling, they can use melatonin, but oftentimes they need a lot less than they think they need. And then if they're doing more of a comprehensive approach, like looking at the other hormones and other neurotransmitters that are involved in sleep, like they can do so much better to support the system rather than just kind of giving them kind of like a one hammer nail kind of scenario, where if you have more of a synergistic low dose approach, like you tend to find that people do much better over time rather than like a higher dose melatonin by itself.
So what are things that people can take with melatonin, or like what would you suggest? Like, I'm not the biggest fan of sleep aids in the first place, but
right.
There's definitely a use case for them. Yeah. I know you guys have worked on some products with that as well. I'm curious, like what your philosophy is, kind of how because you take a multifaceted approach, and it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
So one of the main drivers of sleep disorders these days is a disorder, or a deficiency, I should say, a deficiency in this compound or this neurotransmitter called GABA. GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid. GABA is our neurotransmitter in the brain that helps calm down the firing of the brain. If we're GABA deficient, we don't sleep well. We don't regulate our mood well, so we have depression, we have anxiety. But a big thing is insomnia. And the reason for that is that GABA is extremely important as something that is maintaining itself throughout your evening to prevent some of those more excitatory neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and dopamine to get involved, like especially when you're in REM sleep, for example. So when you're in REM sleep, you could be doing anything crazy, as we all know, but you don't wake up. And why is that actually? Because you actually have GABA around that's helping you maintain sleep, despite all those, that crazy stuff, you're getting chased by a lion or whatever it might be. Like you don't wake up for that a lot of times. 5-HTP or serotonin is also really important for that too, which I can get to, and I will. But GABA is probably your most primary in the sense of keeping you asleep for long periods of time and then helping you maintain that sleep at the same time. So, and many of us are GABA deficient. So when we think about maintaining sleep and helping with sleep overall, melatonin is important because it does make you feel sleepy, and it does decline as you get older. But there are ways, like we said, to help support the melatonin system with circadian rhythm adjustments, et cetera, that can help you very much. But GABA deficiency is really, really, really common because we're all stressed. We're all just a lot of us are over-exercised, doing too much, and as a result of having leaky guts and a lot of inflammation in the system, we deplete GABA. And then if we don't have enough GABA around, as a result, GABA deficiency, again, insomnia, depression, anxiety, tremors, mood disorders, even it's been associated with OCD and schizophrenia as well, actually. So we know that GABA is really important. So when we were thinking about creating something that could really support the sleep cycles itself, we wanted to create something that really enhanced the GABA system primarily, and then also had a little bit of support for melatonin, a little bit of support of 5-HTP. And so, and 5-HTP is what increases serotonin in the brain specifically. And so when you're thinking about GABA, though, you have this receptor, it's called the GABA receptor, and the GABA neurons themselves are these kind of waylay stations. They're like the gates of all of our other processing. So when we were talking about kids earlier and how much information they have to process because they're so open. Like what GABA does is help regulate all that information coming in. And so if you're GABA deficient, you can't regulate all that information very well. They're called interneurons. So like they're kind of in between like your serotonin neurons and your dopamine neurons. And if you're deficient in these neurons or the molecules of GABA itself, you start seeing these issues with over excitability and over stimuli overall, because you just can't regulate it as well. That's because GABA is in this very fine balance with this other neurotransmitter called glutamate. And so glutamate is your excitatory neurotransmitter, and GABA is your primary inhibitory. And so together they make up about 80% of your brain's neurotransmission, so a huge amount. And glutamate imbalance, when you have too much glutamate, you're going to get excitability, you're going to get headaches, you're going to get tremors, and all the things that I was just mentioning, insomnia, if you don't have enough GABA. So what we did was we created something which really supported the GABA receptor in two different ways. One was that it bound to the GABA receptor where GABA would bind. And then at the same time, we found what are called these other molecules that are allosterically binding, which means that they're binding to other sites on the GABA receptor that enhance the affinity for GABA to bind. But the key with this is that if you just give those other things, like those allosteric things, like the things that bind to the receptor but not enhance GABA itself, or give something that gives the same stimulus as GABA. So like if you just give something on the outside of the receptor, but you don't increase the amount of GABA in the system or something like GABA, you're going to deplete GABA over time too. So people that are drinking alcohol or taking benzodiazepines, like they might feel like they get a lot of good sleep initially, but usually they have like severe rebound, like especially for alcohol, you might fall asleep very deeply initially, but then you're awake in 2 to 3 hours, that kind of thing. So the key really is to support the GABA system by creating something that binds to that one of those allosteric sites, but not as tightly as something like a benzo or alcohol, because those cause significant GABA depletion over time. You do something that binds not as tightly, and then at the same time, you give something that binds to the receptor itself, the GABA receptor, so you don't deplete GABA at the same time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So then if you were to deplete GABA like mid-sleep, is that why sometimes you might wake up from a dream? Or is that usually the shock of a dream just sometimes too much to kick you out?
So the shock of the dream sometimes is going to be too much and it'll kick you out. But but overall, one of the reasons why you do wake up in your dreams is because you don't have enough GABA around, especially if you wake up.
You're just getting to the good part of a dream, right?
I know. Yeah, you get out, you're getting in and they're like, oh man, you got to go back in. You never go back in, right? Yeah. Unless you can lucid dream, but that's a different story. But the cool thing about the way we formulated this is we have something called agarine. Agarine is from a psychedelic mushroom, and it is a long-acting GABA agonist, which means that it binds on the GABA receptor where GABA would bind. And so as a result of giving that's just like GABA, okay? The problem with GABA supplements, and I think we talked about this last time, is that GABA supplements don't typically work very well because GABA is too big of a compound, a molecule to get across the blood-brain barrier very easily. If it does get across very easily, then it could mean you have a leaky brain, or the blood-brain barrier is not doing what it's supposed to do to keep things out. All that typically correlates to it's a leaky gut overall. So if you're taking GABA supplements, typically if they are going to work, you have to take huge amounts of GABA to get some across. If you're taking like small amounts of GABA and it's getting across, it typically means you have a leaky blood-brain barrier. And not always, but oftentimes. And that often means you have leaky gut. Yeah.
And so with the Tro-Z specifically, your sleep product, I've personal experience with it. I noticed that you actually have adenosine in it.
We do.
So how does that work? Is that something that, that's essentially creating the sleep pressure? So is that to help with the sleep onset?
Right. So adenosine's in there. It's very, very short acting. Like the half-life of adenosine orally is about 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
Extremely, extremely short acting. But the idea is that it's supposed to help you bind some of those receptors more with adenosine. So for example, if you had late caffeine and you're kind of hyper and you don't want to try to go to bed, like you want to get more adenosine in the system fast so you can unbind or at least compete with those receptors to bind more adenosine there. So it helps people that have late caffeine, for example, but it also helps increase sleep pressure at the same time.
Interesting. Because there's some evidence with apigenin as well with caffeine, right? So is it working kind of a similar process there?
It's a little bit different there. I'm not exactly sure of the combination because I know apigenin is working on the GABA receptors overall, and then apigenin is also working on the dopamine receptors. I'm not sure how it's interacting with adenosine specifically.
Interesting. Well, I'll put a link down below for the Trozy as well, which is a cool product. Definitely going to, it's reset me, but also just going to Europe, things like that. It's probably the only legit sleep aid that I've used. I don't even like calling it a sleep aid. It's something that's kind of helped reset. So I'll link out to that down below as well.
Yeah, and I think you also talked about it when you did your mountaineering Mount Whitney trip, right?
Yeah. Yes. So that was an interesting situation because we needed to be like at the trailhead around like 3 a.m. or so, a little bit earlier, and I'm like, well, this is a situation where it's funny, I forgot I was texting with you that night before, and I need to go to bed earlier, like, because I'm going to get up around midnight, 12:30. Like I need to get at least like 5 or 6 hours of sleep. I accept the fact that I'm not going to have a ton of sleep, but so I took that at I think I took it around like 6:30, and I slept like a rock from like 7 to midnight. Realistically 12:30. So I got not a tremendous amount of sleep, but ordinarily I'd never be able to go to bed at 7, right? So. Yeah. There's cool use cases, like if you're doing extreme things or where you're going to have massive shifts. And my sleep quality was great. I felt phenomenal that day. So definitely an interesting application there. Yeah,
I know. That's super cool. Yeah, I remember you telling me I was out by text. I thought it'd be cool to share. But the nice thing about Trozy, the way we developed it, is that it's this comprehensive sleep formula. So it has all these various things that are important to help you feel sleepy, fall asleep, and then maintain your sleep, right? So we were talking about the GABA system. So we have something called hanochiol or hanochiol, which comes from magnolia bark, which is one of those allosteric binders to the GABA receptor. So it enhances the affinity for GABA to bind. But we don't actually deplete your GABA by doing that because we're giving you agarine at the same time, which is from the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which is not psychedelic. So that mushroom is psychedelic, okay? But agarine is not psychedelic itself. It's a long-acting that works on the GABA receptor, binding to the GABA site, so that you have this non-depletion, but the support of the GABA receptor at the same time. The problem, even if you're taking kava all the time or hanochiol by itself all the time, these are going to deplete GABA over time as well because you're enhancing the affinity for GABA to bind to it. But if you're not giving enough of a GABA supply, then you're going to deplete that over time. And that's the main difference between Trozy and a lot of other sleep formulas, is that it has this combination of the allosteric modulator and what's called the endogenous orthosteric ligand, which is the thing that binds the GABA site of the GABA receptor itself, and that's the agarine.
It's interesting. I've noticed with straight kava, I've noticed just that I actually respond really, really well to kava, but then after a while, it stops working. But then when I come off of it,
you get a tolerance to it as well.
Yes.
Oftentimes,
And when I come off of it, then it takes me a few weeks to actually kind of calm back down.
Yeah.
So, and I never really associated it with that because I do like the way kava makes me feel, but I think I need to treat kava directly more as like an alcohol alternative, maybe if I'm going to go out or something like that.
Yeah, what you're looking at there is classic for depleting your GABA levels by using kava regularly over a period of time. Yeah. And the nice thing about kava is that it's not really an addiction per se, but there is tolerance with it over time. And you will get this mild withdrawal because you're depleting GABA, because you're not giving the GABA at the same time as you're making more GABA bind to its receptors. Yeah. And so that's the key with Trozy, is that we have the hanochiol or hanochiol, people say it different ways, and then you have the agarine, which is combining together so you don't have depletion. So the problem with benzos especially, and like alcohol, is that they bind so tightly to the receptor itself, the GABA receptor, that they deplete GABA very, very quickly, and they cause tolerance, withdrawal, and you could die if you stop these abruptly as well, because of the activation that happens as a result of if you stop these very quickly. And that's the glutamate response. Because again, there's always this balance between glutamate and GABA, right? So in Tro-Z, we're really trying to enhance that GABA tone, and we're doing it in a very supportive way. But we're not just doing that, right? You talked about adenosine in there too, which is giving you sleep pressure. There's also another mushroom in the formula called cordyceps, or cordyceps is derived from the cordyceps mushroom. And cordyceps is super cool. I know you know it from the exercise world. It increases VO2 max in studies, increases exercise performance. But cordyceps, which is the active component of the cordyceps mushroom, but only 0.03% of the mushroom by weight, so a very small amount, has been shown to increase adenosine or work just like adenosine in the body. So you can use it as something that increases sleep pressure and increases deep sleep. And that's why it's in Tro-Z. We have another formula that's called Tromune, actually, that is a low dose of cordyceps that you can take during the day with caffeine, like we were talking about earlier. So you can take it with caffeine, block your adenosine receptors in the brain, and then use that adenosine not to increase sleep pressure, but increase energy production capacity. So, but in Tro-Z, it's specifically for sleep.
Can that consequently improve your tolerance to caffeine as well?
It's a good question. We haven't tested in that capacity, but in general, if you're blocking the receptors with caffeine and you're giving adenosine with it, you're going to need more caffeine to get the same effect, hypothetically, right? Because adenosine is going to be competing with the caffeine to get to bind to those receptors. So in general, you probably would need more caffeine over time if you were taking more adenosine over time. So there's a possibility you might get more of a tolerance with caffeine if you did it all the time. It's not something you want to do probably all the time, because you might create, I would imagine, you might need more caffeine to get the same effect if you're looking for the caffeine effect, the stimulation effect. But if you're looking for an energetic perspective, from ATP production, I don't know if that would get tolerant over time. That's something that I'm not sure if that's been researched. But
interesting, man. Yeah. Well, in addition to Troscriptions, which I'll link out down below, where can everyone find you?
Yeah, so Troscriptions, Tro-Z, and you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Scott Sherr. That's kind of where I do most of my stuff these days, DrScottSherr. And that's the main location otherwise. Yeah.
Right on, man. Yeah. Thanks, brother.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.